Welcome to CivilNet. My guests today are Melanie O'Brien and Elisa from Joeden-Forgey. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So Dr. Melanie O'Brien is Senior Lecturer in International Law at the University of Western Australia. And Dr. Elisa von Joeden-Forgey is the Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University in New Jersey. They are here in Armenia for the third global forum that will take place, the third global forum against the crime of genocide that will take place in December 9. Elisa, we started with you. In 2015, Armenia led global efforts to designate December 9 as the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide and of the Prevention of this Crime. So it's a long title, but in practice, what does this official commemoration day change? I mean, does this reinforce the prevention and also the punishment of the crime of genocide?
I was honored to speak at the first commemoration, the first day of commemoration in 2015. And then and now, I was rather impressed with the idea of setting aside a single day to focus the attention of the international community on the crime of genocide, the importance of honoring the victims of genocide in one way or another, of the importance of accountability, and then certainly of prevention. So in that way, the day really is an extension of Raphael Lemkin's initial goal, right, of preventing and punishing the crime of genocide, which of course became the Genocide Convention. I think that we tend to feel very despairing when we look at the crime of genocide, which is always around us and in the 21st century seems to have picked up pace in more places. But when we look at developments since 1948, we've really created institutions and protocols that will help us eventually, I think, master the prevention of this crime. And so this day, every year, is very important in that respect. And as we see now, having a day like that creates opportunities for collaboration. So in this case, between the government of Armenia and its global forum, right, this is the third, and the United Nations, to then bring a sort of wider group together than is usually possible with the commemoration at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, to bring this wider group together of policymakers and scholars and government officials to talk about certain themes that are critical to prevention. That includes accountability, it includes recognizing the specific suffering of victims of genocide, it includes recognizing the long-term consequences of genocide and how genocides can continue through generations, well past the initial assaults on victims. And it includes then thinking about how do we really begin to reconstruct societies after genocide? What is the work that still needs to be done, even in societies that experienced genocide decades or centuries ago? What work still needs to be done? And what can that tell us about how to work within peacetime societies to prevent genocide in the future? These are conversations that actually don't happen enough. There's a great deal of concern about genocide in the world, but that sort of these practical initiatives, right? These attempts to bring people together to expand the toolbox that we have are still lacking. They're underdeveloped. And so if we look at I think the successes we've had, not successes so much as steps forward that we've taken since 1948, they're really quite large. And now we're taking steps even more quickly, I think, to create protocols that will be extremely helpful before things get totally out of control, when our ability to intervene or productively engage narrows as an international community. So I see this as a very, very important day. And if we continue to build partnerships and collaborations around this day that push forward Raphael Lemkin's original hope, I think we'll see greater success in the future, and it's absolutely necessary that we do if we are to coexist in a way that allows humanity to continue, right? That allows for the survival of humanity in the very near future.
If we go more in deep with that, Melanie, since genocides are either committed by governments or perpetrated with their inaction, since also the states cannot intervene in the internal affairs of other governments, how can the world prevent that? You just used, Elisa, can prevent crime of genocide. We have examples. Recently, we got the Rohingya genocide.
The Rohingya genocide is a perfect example of the failure of prevention, in fact, where states have not stepped in despite multiple warning signs since the 1970s. In fact, the first violence that was committed against the Rohingya happened in 1978, and again in the 1990s, before we got to the more recent violence that we've seen carried out against them. So there have been plenty of warning signs there where states could have taken action. And indeed, it has been discussed at the United Nations, but one of the issues preventing the Security Council from taking action, for example, are the political interests and economic interests of countries like China and Russia, who have a particular interest in Myanmar. So this is always one of the barriers that we come across when it comes to prevention, because the Security Council is a really key body in terms of stopping atrocities taking place, stopping human rights violations. But of course, with the veto power of the Permanent Five, if any of those P5 do not want an issue dealt with, then it simply doesn't get dealt with in the Security Council. So in that regard, there are a lot of politics that stop genocide prevention taking place, beyond even just this sovereignty issue, where other states have an interest in that area. They just don't want to upset the government in question.
Elisa?
That the Rohingya case also shows us the importance of really long-term preventive strategies that involve not only external actors, but particularly internal actors. Much of our prevention mechanism in the world today is focused on external action, on foreign policy, particularly the foreign policy of the great powers. What we have focused less on is grassroots sort of prevention initiatives. And this is a problem for many reasons, one of which is ultimately, if we're going to prevent genocide, there has to be an agreement domestically within societies that given conflict, which is in a sense inevitable, some sort of tensions and conflict, that neither the state nor society is going to resort to or in any way support genocidal strategies. And that requires really grassroots education, capacity building, leveraging of the power of grassroots leaders, the creation of bridges between society, between groups within society that may in fact, whose tensions may in fact enable genocide down the road or give politicians a kind of foothold within genocidal ideology. So we need to really think about this long term. As Mel was mentioning, the Rohingya genocide there were many stages when things could have been done differently to prevent what's happening now. There were many red flags. Well, back into the 60s, we see the denial of identity and the denial of citizenship that continues up to this day of the Rohingya. That is a red flag, right, in all societies when certain groups' identities are denied. And, internal agents, internal actors are the ones who understand best their own society and ways that they might bridge tensions, bridge group, historical group grievances, and sort of predict what their state is going to do. So, for example, one of the key failures of the international community was to recognize that in any democratization process, there is also the specter and the threat of genocide. In Rwanda, that was the case. And here, really, the stepping up of violence against the Rohingya started in 2011, many human rights experts suggest, so that, and this coincides, of course, with the democratization of Myanmar. So sometimes steps forward in human rights, right, or in what's considered good governance, can in fact lay the groundwork for the very sorts of existential struggles that lead leaders to choose genocidal policies, right, as a form of governance. So that's what we see in Myanmar. So I would ask the world really to focus on this long-term strategy, thinking about genocide as a form of networking, genocide prevention as a form of networking and collaboration across state lines, but also across groups within a conflict-prone society.
But if there are some political, strategical interests that lead to a genocide, how can we prevent?
Yeah. Well, this is the problem, right? We have to prevent genocide, so we have to find means to do it. Outside actors are so important in setting the stage for genocide, and this is one of the reasons so few genocides are appropriately addressed, right, and effectively addressed. The world could stop genocide if it wanted to, but you're right, there are too many vested interests in so many of these struggles in Iraq, in Myanmar, and Sudan, and that's why they're not stopping, and that's why they're allowed to continue. What has to happen, though, is that this kind of training and leverage building and capacity building also needs to happen at the UN level, at the Security Council level, at the level of intergovernmental diplomacy, right? We need to see the same language being used from the bottom up and the top down, so that we have more voices engaged in this and we all start speaking as a global humanity the same language of prevention. I think that's our only choice, because if we rely on military intervention, history has suggested that not only does that usually not happen because it's so politically volatile for the states involved, but it can make things worse. So, yeah.
One of the means of prevention that exists but hasn't been connected with genocide is the human rights system. And 70 years ago we had the Genocide Convention created, but we also had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it created this entire human rights system that we have today with a whole lot of human rights treaties, but also the treaty bodies that oversee the definition and the implementation of the rights within that. And in fact, in my research, I've discovered that in the genocide process, there is a pattern of human rights violations that occur, from discrimination through to freedom of expression, freedom of movement, right to family, all the way through to violation of the right to life, obviously. And actually, I think that this is a pattern that we can use for midstream prevention, because once we see some of these rights violations happening in a particular order, we can ascertain that actually there is a risk that this is going to become genocide. And then what we can do is use the human rights mechanisms that we already have. So use the High Commissioner for Human Rights, use the UN treaty bodies that we have, looking at civil and political rights, looking at discrimination against women, looking at racial discrimination. Use these bodies, use the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review to actually work with states to ensure that they stop violating rights before it escalates to the violence that is genocide.
Always related to that, this week we also celebrate the 17th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which recognized genocide as a crime under international law. How can we use this definition under international law to recognize cases of genocide happening nowadays? And how also can we use this convention in regards of cases that occurred before the creation of this convention? And I relate that to Armenian case, the Armenian genocide.
Ani, it's a very challenging question. In terms of using the definition for recognition, the convention, this is what it gave us in 1948. It gave us the definition of genocide. 5 enumerated acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnic or religious group. And it's this intent to destroy the group that differentiates genocide from other international crimes such as war crimes or crimes against humanity. And so this is what we need to look at when we are identifying whether a particular situation is genocide or not. So we have to look at it and say, is there an intent to destroy that group? Or is it crimes against humanity or war crimes, which have slightly different definitions within them? So that's where we start from that. In terms of applying the convention to past atrocities that happened before the convention came into being, so the convention was created in 1948, but it came into force in 1951. And in fact, here I have to say it's really difficult because there are two main principles in law. One comes from criminal law, and this principle is nullum crimen sine lege, which means no crime without law. And what that means is you can't be punished for something that wasn't prohibited at the time. And that's actually a really fundamental aspect of human rights and ideas of the right to fair trial, because we need to know what behaviour is wrong and what we can and can't do. And so it's unfair to punish someone for something that wasn't prohibited at the time. Now there's a similar parallel rule in international law that is the non-retroactivity of treaties. So what this means is that no country is bound by a treaty before the time that that treaty entered into force for that country. So it's these similar concepts that law can't apply in retroactivity. Now, Armenia and Turkey are both parties to the Genocide Convention, but obviously that was a significant time after the Armenian genocide actually occurred. So in terms of being able to take action under the Genocide Convention, for example, if Armenia went to the International Court of Justice under the convention and said that Turkey has violated the convention, that's actually not possible, because it's retroactive application of the treaty. There's also a debate about whether the crime of genocide existed prior to Raphael Lemkin's creation of the word in the 1940s, and then the creation of our modern definition a bit later, a few years later. And what has been found is that genocide could occur before then, but the crime of genocide did not exist. So this makes it quite difficult. Even if you look at the Nuremberg trials, the post-World War II trials, even though essentially they were prosecuting people for genocide, they didn't actually use the charge of genocide, because even though the word was slipped in there through Raphael Lemkin's influence, it wasn't actually a charge. So this is the great dilemma that we have, that we say genocide could certainly have occurred and did occur, as we know, in 1915, did occur before the Genocide Convention, but the crime of genocide didn't exist in law.
I'd like to add something to that. I think that's very important. This sort of legal problem we have with this retroactive application of the term. But you know, something that's often overlooked is that Raphael Lemkin was a sociologist too, in a sense. And so he wrote about the histories of genocide in order to come up with his term genocide that became eventually a legal term. So there are other ways to claim genocide than simply a legal claim. And you know, we see it today, these debates about have the Yazidi experienced genocide, is the Rohingya case really a genocide? These debates all revolve around a term that was brokered by international politics after World War II, but that has been expanded by scholars, by historians, by sociologists, by anthropologists, to look more at processes and patterns in particular that are indicative of the crime, that are indicative of an intent to destroy in whole or apart a group as such. And in that way, I think we can very productively begin to talk about genocides in the past tense and think about accountability for genocides that were never adjudicated as such, in the past. Accountability doesn't, it's not simply a legal issue, it's also a diplomatic issue, and a civil society issue. So there are other domains in which accountability occurs that are still important, even though in a legal sense we're a little bit hamstrung in the way that we can use the term.
After what you said, I have another question related to that. Can we say that it's, according to what you said, hopeless in some way to claim for Armenians the recognition of a genocide, or even the punishment of those who perpetrated in the past? Well, they don't exist anymore, but I mean of a state perpetrator of a genocide. Is it now hopeless or vain from Armenians to demand this?
Absolutely not. No, of course not. I mean, recognition is so key for healing. You know, it's part of the healing process. And even though it may be difficult or possibly impossible through legal avenues to obtain, for example, reparations from the Turkish government, at a minimum, recognition can offer this sense of healing and I mean, it's a really important part of the process for victims. So absolutely not. It's really important that this process goes through. And what that can lead to, you know, is added memorialization and remembrance and, you know, not forgetting what took place.
Yeah, yes, I think I agree. I think it's absolutely not hopeless, and it's critical, right, to continue to press this point. There is not one genocide program in the world that excludes the Armenian genocide, right? Scholars agree that what happened to the Armenians in World War I was a genocide. The International Association of Genocide Scholars, on the board of which both of us have served, and Melanie is now serving, has written a resolution, right, recognizing the Armenian genocide as a genocide. So, you know, in terms of what does that mean, that's something that has to be, you know, decided within, I would suggest, a peace-building framework. So how can one recognize a genocide in a way that it promotes peace in a region and adds to the security and stability of the very people who were persecuted in the past? You know, and this is something that so many groups struggle with who experienced genocide before 1948. I mean, I come from the United States, and Native Americans, of course, experienced genocide, and it still has not been recognized by our state, and there have been no attempts really at repair of genocide, and we still have genocidal institutions that are having a genocidal impact on Native people in the United States, and it's not recognized as such. These institutions are called different things. So, for example, I won't get too far into this, but Native groups in the United States some of them experience child removal for child welfare purposes 10 times in excess, right, of what other groups in the United States experience. So their children are being removed 10 times more than other families, even when you adjust for family income, right, and other indices, 10 times more. And this is the heritage of having boarding schools, right, where children were forcibly removed from their families to be civilized and you know, to lose their Indianness. So these genocidal strategies, these ideas, these narratives, they last much longer, and they have to be repaired if you're going to have a normal, functioning, peaceful society. And it's true of Australia too. Perhaps Mel can speak to that. But you also come from a society where we struggle with this, and it's very frustrating because we continue genocidal strategies without them being recognized as such.
Absolutely, it's a current issue in Australia. Yeah. The Uluru Statement, Indigenous Aboriginal population is endeavouring to to make part of Australian law is a step in the healing process that they are seeking to have, and our government is denying them that right. So again, it is this recognition, and there is debate in Australia over whether it amounted to genocide. There's pretty much certainty that it at least happened on the island of Tasmania. But in terms of, there are similar things that happened to North America. We call them the stolen generation, and these are Aboriginal children who are now adults. They're still alive in Australia, and they were taken from their families to be raised as servants within white people's homes. And so this is ongoing from the start of colonisation or invasion in Australia from the 1700s, and still has an impact today. And this concept that you're talking about of recognition, absolutely it is important, and certainly not hopeless. And I think, you know, in terms of the Armenians that I know, but also coming from a country with its own problem, it is a really crucial step for governments to take to publicly acknowledge what happened in the past in order to be able to to reconcile with each other and to move forward.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing to that, right? If we're going to prevent genocide, we have to recognize the patterns that come out of the past. And this is part of the importance of domestic approaches to genocide prevention. So in the United States, for example, one of the human rights abuses being perpetrated now by the United States is the separation of children from their families at the border. And this follows, you see, right, the pattern of child separation and family dissolution, which is a core component of genocidal strategies across time and space. So, you know, if societies don't address what they've done in the past, they can continue those policies, right, that are quasi-genocidal, certainly can unfortunately radicalize into, you know, genocide through killing, right? Or they can remain on a sort of lower level of genocidal strategies that don't amount to mass graves or mass death. But in any fashion, we're in the space of genocide when these sorts of things are going on. And so it's absolutely critical that genocides are recognized in the past so that the world can move forward in a more positive direction.
All right, then now we go back to the forum. Yeah. This is my last question. So this year's forum is dedicated to prevention of the crime of genocide through education, culture, museums. In your opinion, both of you, how relevant this topic is, and also what would you propose as a main focus for the next global forum?
This topic is absolutely relevant. Elisa mentioned grassroots, and this is where I think this is what we're talking about when we talk about education, culture, and museums. Because at education level, we're talking about children, we're talking about young people going through school and learning not necessarily about genocide, which they will do later in high school, but learning about concepts such as inclusion and diversity. And this is where really attitudes of genocide start. They start with difference and hatred. And if we can teach our children, you know, at a young age to be accepting of difference and diversity, to be inclusive, then this is a really fundamental grassroots way of working on prevention. And it's a similar idea with museums. You know, the everyday person doesn't spend time studying genocides, but the everyday person goes to a museum. And from the museum, they can get an idea of what happened in the past, and maybe it makes them think about how their own behaviour, how they perceive other people. And it is a method of prevention in that way. In terms of thinking about the next global forum and another topic, I would personally like to see some discussion about the gendered element of genocide. And so not just how genocide is carried out in a gendered manner, which it certainly is. We see men tortured and killed, we see women raped in genocide. But also, I want to see a conversation bringing together not just genocide prevention, but also more fundamental issues of human rights and gender equality. Because again, this is at the grassroots level, is this inherent inequality of women in society. And through having this discussion and promoting a change in societal attitudes towards women, I'm hoping that ultimately what that can lead to are lower levels of violence against women in our everyday society, but also, you know, a change in thinking about violence in a bigger picture as well.
Yeah, there's been actually, to speak to that point about gender, there's been research done that demonstrates statistically that the societies in which there's greater inequality between men and women are also societies more prone to conflict, whether internal or external. There's a wonderful book called Sex and World Peace where this argument is made. And the authors of that book suggest something very interesting, which is when you have gender relations that are very asymmetrical, and one sex is in power in the domestic sphere in a very clear way, it encourages young people to see the world in terms of adversarial binaries. Male, female, Hutu, Tutsi, right? So, you know, German, Jewish, these binaries that are behind so many genocidal categories. And so they've linked that kind of space of the family and domestic violence, or even very authoritarian cultures of child rearing, to a sort of conceptual universe that is already vulnerable to genocidal thinking. So in that way, I think gender becomes extremely important, because we see gender violence and gender asymmetry as a contributor to genocidal trends within society, and that's new. That's new. In general, the research has looked at, you know, conflicts between different ethnic or national or religious groups, because those are the groups enumerated in the Genocide Convention. But gender is a very, very important contributor, and we really can't, I'm quite sure, prevent genocide without looking at those aspects within the domestic sphere. So I think that's a very good idea. The one other suggestion I would make for, or maybe two, for future global forums, one is climate change, right? We have to find a way to make sure that that climate change does not reduce, right, people to these opposing groups, right? That it doesn't become an existential threat to groups, such that genocide becomes a rational response, right, to the problem of limited resources. So as a species, if we want to survive, it's critical not simply that we take on climate change as such, that we find a way to challenge global warming, but that we find ways to operate as a common humanity in a world where our resources are shrinking. And we can do that, but you know, it needs some thought, and it needs planning, and it needs planning right now. This is critical. Otherwise, we can't have that many more global forums in the future, right? Where our time may be limited. So I think that's on my mind a great deal. And another is simply, you know, I don't know what we would quite call it, but kind of a grassroots focus where we look at institutions, tools, right, and mechanisms for prevention that are concrete, that societies can put into place at the, you know, at various levels of organization, particularly at the government, security sector, and NGO levels, such that they are much more resilient in the face of conflict in the future. And that, of course, is part of a strategy to deal with climate change, but, you know, also would deal with other threats that could be seen as existential threats.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Elisa, for this really interesting interview, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching, and continue to follow CivilNet.